We'll do a review in Likutei Sichos in Chelik Chav Hey. This is volume 25. This is the first Sicha, just Toldos. And in this Sicha, the Rebbe discusses Rashi's commentary that Esav tricked father by asking him questions which sounded that he looked very religious. He asked him, how do you give a tithing from salt and straw? And the Rebbe argues that what kind of a tricking his father would that be? On the contrary, his father would be very disappointed because it does not seem to be answering the knowing the halachas, because the halacha is you don't have to give meiser not from heaven and not from salt. So it would show a lack of knowledge on Esav's part. And what did he see his father do? Why didn't he know? And the Rebbe is going to explain that the issue, this is first of all not really Meiser, which is the law of Meiser after Matan Torah. The Rebbe says this is either one of two things, either Avraham, we see before Vayitin Loy Meiser Mekoil, so this is part of that Meiser, or this is part of tzedakah. But nevertheless, either way, the question that uh, Esav had is not that you have to give meiser because this is potter, but he wanted to show that even things that you don't have to, he still gives meiser. But the question is, how do you tithe it? The question was because salt and straw value is when you use it on their own, they have a very little value. So they wanted to know, do you give the tithing about looking at the salt as it is? So you need just a small part of tithing, or since the salt enhances so much the food, you have to give it the increased value because of what it accomplishes. The same thing is with straw. As we'll see in great detail in the Sikha, we're learning the Sikha Lila Nishmas Sarav Levi Yitzchok, and this should be a benefit of his soul, for his soul. Tei Nishmos Yitzru B'Tzur Chaim. And let's go step by step. Toldos, Aleph. In Pasig Vayigdulu Hanaorim Vayhi Esov Ish Yedei Tzayid Ish Soda. So the pasuk says when the lads grew old, it's talking about uh, that Yaakov and Esav when they grew up, and Yosef and Esav was a man who knew how to hunt. He was a man of the field, and Yaakov was Ishtam Yeshiv Aholim. Yaakov used to sit in the tents. He used to sit and study. So the simple meaning of Yedei Tzayid means that he knows how to hunt. Hunt would mean knows how to trap animals. But Rashi learns different. And in the Ha'ara, the Rebbe is not discussing it. In the Sikha, the Rebbe in the Pnim, in the Ha'ares discusses why Rashi doesn't learn the simple pshat of Yedei Tzayid because it's duplicate with Ish Soda, but that's not the topic of the Sikha. The topic of the Sikha is Rashi does explain. Why Rashi explains that way, that's another issue, but we're trying to understand now what Rashi says. Stelt sich Rashi if the Werter Yedei Tzayid, he knows how to hunt, he knows how to trap. And Rashi says this is actually knew how to trap Yitzchak. He knew how to pretend and make Yitzchak think that he is a righteous person, Esau. And so Rashi in Mefarish, Lotzud ul es ovi b'fiv, to trap and to deceit his father with his mouth. How? He pretended to be what he's not. Vishoyaloi, he used to ask his father, Abba, father, Heich ma'asrin es hamelech, how do you tithe, give a tenth for salt, or ves hateven, and the straw? And this was kasovur aviv shu medagdeg b'mitzvahs. His father thought, oh, he's so particular with mitzvahs that he's making sure to tithe the melech, to tithe the teven. And that's how he trapped him. That's where he tricked him. He wasn't really religious, but he asked him all these questions to appear to be very stringent. So let me Meforshim. So Meforshim explain why did he ask his father about the salt and the straw? As those was Esav had gefragt wegen Melech und Teven Davke. Why did he specifically ask about salt and straw? Is weil sie seinen in ganzen Potur von Meiser, because they are totally exempt from Meiser, euch mit Rabbonon. Even from the rabbis, they also didn't institute Meiser. Sometimes there is certain Meisers which is with Rabbonon, but over here it's not even Meiser with Rabbonon. So, what did he want to impress his father by asking, how do you tithe from something which you're not obligated? Und der Method Esav gewollt weisen, therefore Esav wanted to show as is so viel medagdig b'mitzvahs, that he is so careful in mitzvahs, bis as git meiser, to the extent that he's careful that he gives a tithe euch von Sachen, welche seinen Potter von Meiser, also from items that are exempt from Meiser. That's how he deceived his father with his mouth, asking him this question to pretend like he gives Meiser even from things that are exempt. And that's how he cheated and misled his father. But if this is the case, if this is the case, what he tried to accomplish by asking this question, it's surprising. Wenn Esav wollt bepoil mafrish given Meiser von Melach und Teven, if he had actually separated Meiser from salt and straw, that would show what das gekent weisen of Digdug b'mitzvahs, then that could have shown that he's very particular with the mitzvahs because he's giving Meiser also from these items. Aber beim Fragen, but when he was asking, wie soll mishet fuzei op Meiser? If he told his father that he gave Meiser from that, okay, then we would see. But he asked his father a question, how do you separate Meiser? He is not saying that he separates, he's just saying, how do you separate? Is nicht bloß as der mit hat nicht gekannt ausnehmen bei Yitzchak, und not only that he could, that would not help him impress Yitzchak about his religiosity of Esau, not adrabe, on the contrary, worin die Scheile weiß Gott sein Amaratzes. This question shows on his ignorance. As weiß nicht Hilchas Meiser, he doesn't know the laws of Meiser. So asking such a question would put, if he would say that he's giving, that's fine. By asking how do you give, meaning the assumption is that you have to give Meiser. So he's showing his father that he's doesn't know the halacha that salt and straw don't need Meiser. Noch mehr. Furthermore, Esav hat sich doch gehodevet bei Yitzchak in Stub. Esav was raised in the house of Yitzchak. Asach Yorim for many years von sein Kindheit und Jugend, from his childhood and youth. Unoi beristak azava sucht zu seiner medagdig b'mitzvahs, if he is someone who is looking to be particular b'mitzvahs, der hat sich gewollt herausweisen, that he's trying to show off to his father how particular he is, hat gewiss noch geguckt, so for sure he had followed, he looked at the Yitzchak is Mekayim mitzvahs, how Yitzchak was doing mitzvahs, because he wanted to show that he's a medagdig with mitzvahs. Und hat sicher gedacht merken, so certainly he should have noticed, as Yitzchak git nit ke Meiser from Melech v'Teven, that he does not give Meiser from salt and straw. Heint, wie also hat gemeint, so therefore, how did he think, oh, he's nemen by Yitzchak, and he's going to impress Yitzchak with the Shaila Hechma Asr Nechula, how do you give tithe? When he grew up and he saw by Yitzchak, and the Yitzchak he's saying, what? There's no tithing there. Why is he asking such a question? So that would not impress Yitzchak by asking a question which he never saw in the house of Yitzchak, never gave tithing from Melech and Teven, which is pot. To me, is not grass. The surprising greater. This is all the questions are based on the assumption, as the Mefarshim explained, that you don't have to give Meiser, and he was trying to give Meiser from something that you don't have to, and he didn't actually give the Meiser, but he was asking the question. The questions put him in a position of, oh, first of all, being ignorant and not knowing what his father was doing. And why would he not know if he grew up there, if he's trying to show off? And the surprise, the Rebbe says, is even greater because the exact language of Rashi makes it even more difficult to try to interpret as compared uh, to the Tanchuma. The Teuchen for Pirush Rashi is there, the content of this Pirush Rashi, this interpretation, the Esav had gewollt beweisen Yitzchok, as er is am Dagdig mitzvah, is that Esav wanted to show to Yitzchok that he's careful with mitzvahs, steht sei in Tanchuma und sei in Bereshis Rabbah. It's brought down in two places, in Tanchuma and Bereshis Rabbah. Rashi chooses the language of the Bereshis Rabbah versus the Tanchuma. In Tanchuma, steht es mit Hashinu Loshen. In Tanchuma, there's a change of language. As Esav had gefragt Yitzchokun, Esav asked Yitzchokun, Mahu shet hei chayeves b'maiser. He was asking him whether it's obligated in Meiser. So that was a question, not how do you give Meiser, but do you have to, is it obligated in Meiser? Aber in Bereshis Rabbah, but in Bereshis steht bedoimet zum Loschen, was Rashi sagt, Pirushay, over there is similar to the Rashi's language. He says, Heich misaknin milcha, heich misaknin tivna. How do you fix? Rashi says, how do you tithe? Over there is, how do you fix the salt to be allowed to be consumed? Or how do you fix the straw to allow it to be used? Was von dem Loschen is mashma v'meforshim zogun. That language, it appears the way it's brought down in Bereshis Rabbah, as Mefarshim say, as those was Melech v'Teven seinen mechuyev of Meiser, that Melech and Teven that you're obligated to give Meiser is by Esav and Cain Sofik nit given. That wasn't even a doubt. He didn't ask Shetehei Chayeves like in Tanchuma. In Medrash Rabbah, the question is, how do you? Shaili is not given. How do you tithe? You have to tithe it, but how do you tithe? So, and Rashi says also, meaning that the fact that you have to give, that's obvious. It's only how do you do? Kum tuis, as Rashi kleibt tuis, davke dem nusach. Rashi chooses the language by quoting, means basically, or using the language of the Bereshis Rabbah, was is noch aleph magdil the am haratzes von Esaven. This even increases Esav's ignorance by concluding that you have to give Meiser. He's just asking how, but he's saying you give Meiser, but how do you do it? As ba'im is borur as melech v'teven zayin l'chai v'Meiser. He knows for sure that salt and straw is obligated to Meiser. The question is how. So, which is wrong because Teven and Melech are not chai v'Meiser. And Beis, and also them nitba merken as Yitzchok ein Meiser Melech und Teven, the fact that he didn't notice that Yitzchok does not tithe salt and straw. So why would he think for sure that you have to give it when his own father didn't do it? And so it makes it more difficult when Rashi could have at least brought down the question the way it's in that Esau's question, with the way it's in Tanchuma, to ask whether you're obligated or not. So therefore, that would be not a certainty, not against it, but that would be just trying to find out. And here Rashi chooses Davke, this language, which seems to say that he concluded wrongly. He was trying to impress his father with something that he was wrong, because you don't have to give Meiser, and he doesn't know this, and he says for sure you have to, and he doesn't know that his father never gave that. Why wouldn't he know that? And as we'll see, the Rebbe learns no, that it's not about the obligation of Meiser, it's about another obligation of tzedakah, or the Meiser, the way is before Matan Torah, which would be obligatory in this case as well. And his question was, how do we do the Meiser, as we will see. Base. Euch is nicht verstandig. Further, it's also not understood. Wie passt Bechlal zu fragen, Heich Maasrim? How does it fit at all to ask this question? What does it mean? How do you tithe? Tithe means very simple. You take 1/10. If it's obligated to give Meiser, the salt and the straw, so what's his question is, how do you give a tithe? You take 10% and you give it jeder weiß den Poshet und Teich von Meiser. Everybody knows the very simple translation of tithing, a zentel, a tenth, is in vos bastei de Shaila. So what is the question, Hech Maser? Vazoy nimmt man Meiser a zentel von Melech v'teven? How do you take a tenth of salt and straw? You take a tenth. What is the question? Uh, so the Rebbe actually says the exact language of Rashi makes it even more difficult than the Medrash, which is Rashi's source. But there, the Lashon is Heich Mesaknin, and Rashi says Heich Ma'aser. Heich Mesaknin, we can still try. How do you fix it? It's not how to tithe it is easier. In Medrash can man noch answer. In the Medrash we can answer. As the Shaila, und the Shaila Hanal Sif Aleph, that this question, what is the asking? How do you do? And this also answered the question of Sif Aleph. Well, why is he asking when it's not mechuyev, really? That's actually why the Medrash writes, how do you fix salt and straw? Not how do you tithe. How are we going to explain like this? Avade hat Esav gewusst, as Melech v'teven seine Potter for Meiser. For sure, Esav knew that salt and straw are exempt from Meiser. Sein Shaila is aber heich misakne. How do you fix it? What's the question? Since we find that you need to take a tithing from the grain of the seed that grows, of the that you sown, the crops, you have to give a tenth. You give a tenth to the behemoth. In order to show that the Eibishter belongs to everything and you give him a tenth, darf doch sein etwas an ähnlicher Pule wie Tikkun, so there should be something similar, an act, not tithing, we don't do that, but there should be some correction. Euch bei die Sachen, welche seine Potter von Meiser. Also, those items that are exempt from Meiser, how do you fix them? But what do you do to show that they belong to the Eibishter? As euch bei sie, soll man beweisen, als sie kommen von dem Eibishter. They too should show that they come from the Eibishter. Und das ist given Shaila says, so this is, we can explain what Asa was asking. If, according to the Medrash, the way it's lost in the Lashon of the Medrash, how do you fix them? You don't give a tithe because you're not mechuyev, but you should do something, because to, just like the tithe over there helps you that you're giving to the Eibush, you should give something to the Eibush there too. Since there is no mitzvahs meiser, the question is, how do we correct it? So therefore, we also don't have the question, wie passt Gott zu fragen? Bemele fällt euch auf die Scheile, wie passt Gott zu fragen, how you can even ask, hey, Maasim, the Rebbe asked the question on Rashi, why are you asking? It's a tenth. But it's not what he asked. He didn't ask Ech Maasim, he asked Ech Mesaknim. Er hat Taka nicht gefragt, Ech Maasim. He wasn't asking, how do you tithe? Nor Ech Mesaknim, how do you fix it when there is no tithe? How do you fix it? That was his question. So we don't have that issue according to the language of the Medrash, the Medrash Rabbah says. Well, if he's ever dit be noch größer, according to this, the surprise is even greater. Favos is Rashi Meshana for Loshna Medrash. So why does Rashi change from Loshna Medrash? Which seems that Mesaknin, Heich Mesaknin would be okay. When I start Heich Mesaknin, Zokter Heich Maasim, how do you tithe? We don't understand what's the question, how do you tithe? What's the problem, how do you tithe? And we don't understand why would he even come to the conclusion that you have to tithe when the halacha is that you don't have to tithe it. And he was showing himself as ignorant. And he's not knowing what his father did. So how do we reconcile? But first, the Rebbe has to establish over here in Eis Gimel that even though in the source of Rashi, in the halacha, it's mashma that we're talking about the din of Meiser, but Rashi doesn't have to follow the source. Rashi goes Pshute Shal Mikra. By Rashi, it could mean something different than the Meiser that we're discussing in Halacha to give Meiser. According to Rashi, we can be talking about another level of Meiser. That's the Gimel, the Yeshleimar. So first, we're going to establish that we're talking here not about the Meiser of the Torah, which wasn't actually applicable to Melech and Tevin. V'yeshleimar der bir in them, so we can say the explanation. Machengeret kama pa'omim, we already discussed many times. As Rashi is mefarish pshuta shel mikra, Rashi explains the simple meaning of the verse. As Rashi says, lebosya lepshuta shel mikra, I only come to simple meaning of the verse. Afilu when das is nicht behesen mit dem chelik halacha shebetoira, even if it doesn't fit the halachic part of the Torah, which means min ha-Torah there's no meiser by Melech and Tevin, and yet, according to Rashi, there could be an obligation by Melech and Tevin. Rashi doesn't have to follow way the halach is. Weil derech zeh bin nit nidan. The shaila heich ma'asin es ha-Melech ves ha-Tevin in Pirush Rashi. The question, how do you tithe Melech and Tevin in Rashi, is nicht verbunden mit der mitzvah von Meiser Zroim shel Achrim Matan Torah. That is not associated, it's not tied to the mitzvah of tithing the Zroim that comes after Matan Torah. Nor mit mitzvahs meises was hat demult, but it had to do the mitzvahs meises was hat demult neue given that of that time it was accustomed lepshuta shel mikra. So that's the meises we're talking about. And the Rebbe gives now two possibilities of the meises that it might be discussed before. Frier in Parshas Lech Lecha werd erzählt. Before in the portion of Lech Lecha it's related. No, then the Avram hat man erzählt, when the Dal Malach, Avram went to free his nephew Lot, and he beat the four kings that captured Lot. It says, Umalki Tzedek Melech Sholem, he was the king of Sholem, one of the five king that Avram helped to win the four kings. Who koyed? He says he was a kohen gamer. He says Vayiten loy meiser mikoil. So Rashi teaches Vayiten loy meiser. He gave him. Who gave to whom? Rashi says that Abraham gave the kohen, gave Malki Tzedek meiser from everything. Is Rashi mefarish? Rashi explains Vayiten loy. Avram gave to Malki Tzedek Melech Sholem. He gave him meiser mikol asher loy from all that is his. Lefisha hoya kohen. Because he was a kohen. So what do we see from here? As Aleph, Avram had gegeben Meiser to Malki Tzedek. So we see that he gave Meiser to Malki Tzedek, who was a kohen. But he didn't just give him Meiser, er hat gegeben Mikol Asher Loi. that he gave everything that was his. So not only did he give him, the Farshim explained that he gave him from, they just had the war and he collected all the spoil from the war, so he gave him a tithe of that. No, he gave him everything that he had, not only from the war. The war would be sort of a meches, but this he gave him a meiser as a kohen. Farshim zog, as the mint made Rashi shelu zayin dem pirush. That Rashi says Mekola Shaloi, Rashi is coming to reject the interpretation as der Meiser was Avram had gegeben is bloß given that the Meiser that Avram gave was only for Shlal Milchama from the spoil of the war. Was das is mefurish b'mikra bazunder. That is separately articulated in the posik that he gave him from the spoil of the war. With the posik is dort gleich mamshich, and the posik continues. Right ways as Avram had gesagt. Im mechut v'goymer v'mekchem kol asher loch, that he didn't want to take not even a string and etc. and anything that belongs to you, as it had gar nicht genommen von dem Sholstein. From the Sholstein he took nothing. Nor der Meiser is given mikol asher loy. The Meiser was from everything that Avram had, not the spoil, which is later, but everything that he had. Zetman. So we see as Avram was given to give Meiser, we saw that Avram had the custom to give tithing. Mikol Asher Loi Avram. From everything that he had, he gave everything that Avram had. Mikol Asher Loi Avram, he gave to the Kohen. Von alle seinen Nechosim. Kimefurish Frier. What did he own? Pasuk says, Tzoyin, Goymer, Vavodim, Goymer, Keser, Vizov, all kinds of items. They are not Meiser's Roim. These are all assets that he had. And from all this, he gave him a tenth. The Torah says in the Pasuk before, the Hashem says he loves Abraham because Abraham will instruct his sons and his family that follows V'shomru derech havaya lasit tzedakah mishpat, so that they keep the way of Hashem to do charity and justice. Is move on. It's understood as Euch Yitzchok hat sich hazei neue given, that Yitzchok also conducted himself such, und hat gegeben Meiser nicht nur für seine Tvua. Not only did he give a tithe from his grain, Avram did this. Avram gives a kol shaloi. He didn't just do the regular, what you mechuyev later on. Wie Rashi bringt weiter auf dem Posig bei Yimtzo, Goymer Meir Sha'orim, that he found that Yitzchak found 100 times as much as when he planted Ba'aretz B'Shana, he planted and he found 100 times as much, and he gave a tithe. Nor Meiser Mikol Ashaloi. So Yitzchak must have given also everything that he owned, just like Abraham gave it, because Abraham was teaching his children Yitzhav Bonov to do what he did, and he gave Vayitloi Meiser Mikol. He gave Malki Tzedek. He gave Meiser from everything. So this would be fitting with the pshat that Meiser was that Abraham Vayitloi Meiser Mikol is Abraham gave to Malki Tzedek. And the Rebbe wants to say that even according to the other pshat, Vayitel Meiser Mekoil means that Malki Tzedek gave Avram Meiser Mekoil. There is still the idea of Meiser then as well, even though not this pasuk. You say to Mizar, we can save him more than this. As Azoy is lekol ifane pirush haTorah. This is according to all ways to explain the Torah that Avram hat mit Kaim given kol haTorah kulo. Meaning, even if we should say that Avram didn't give Malki Tzedek, but Bechlal, Avram fulfilled all of Torah. Koilel oich mitzvahs tzedakah, also the mitzvah of charity, upon him, at least Meiser mehakeren, Meiser from the principle. Un yitzave es bon of lasit tzedakah goymer, and he would instruct this also his children that they should give Meiser, at least from the principle, as the Shulchan Aruch, the Rebbe quotes, is at least the principle of tithe. That's the mitzvah tzedakah. So now, since there's a whole other point of Meiser, we understand very simply. Was Esav had gemeint? What did Esav mean? Welndik oisnem by sein Taten. He wanted to impress his father. Mit sein Shaila heich maasen es hamelech ve'esateven. How do you tithe the salt and the straw? Weil Yitzchok hat mafrish given Meiser from melech ve'esateven because he did. He wanted to know how to do it. Wie bald euch hat mafrish given Meiser mekol ashaloi because he also gave him everything that was his. That's what Yitzchok did, so Esav is doing it too. The Shaila von Esav is blois given. His question was not whether you have to, he knew that you have to, because his father did it. Tafke's father did it. But the question is, how do you tithe? It'll come on, as we'll see later on. As the Rebbe will explain now that the issue is here, how do you give the tithing of straw and salt? Do you give them by their small value, a tenth of that value, or you give them the way they are later on enhanced because of the enhancement that they provide, and that makes their real value, so you have to give a greater tenth from that. Dalet. Der Tzada Shove von Melach und Tevin. What's the common denominator of salt and straw? Is there Anderskeit legabe andere Sachen? How are they different than other matters? Is was für sich allein haben sie nicht kein größer Cheshivas. For them themselves, on their own, they're not so important. Aber b'shas men mish sei zusammen mit andere Sachen, but when you mix them together with other things, hat man von seher te'elis, then you have such a benefit, was is shalei berech mer v'zer te'elis b'fnei asman, which is infinite, uncomparable, greater benefit than their benefit is on their own. Salt on their own is very little, but when you put salt in something, it can make a major difference. As we see practically, as a klein bisel melech, that a little bit, a small amount of salt, was ein kamus for sich, hat sehr wenig, shove kesef v'chashiv, the quantity of that little salt has very little value of money or importance. Gita rein tam in a tafshul umachel. That can give, that little bit of salt gives taste in a cooked and a food, and improves them. Ashevach v'cheasach mer gresser from kurter melech, which makes it much more, improved it much more, and greater than that little drop of salt. Und nicht nur ahaisofes tam, doesn't just add taste, nor beoifen as on the melech, it is so necessary that without the salt, felt beklolos achilas hamaichel. It's the whole food is like tasteless without salt. But the shoyin hakosuf, as the pasuk, to use the language of the pasuk in Eiv, hayochel tofel mibli melech. Can you eat something tofel which has no salted? Without salt, this is not edible. So you need the salt to eat it, so it makes it enhance, it makes it into a food. Valderech zet heaven, in a similar way is the straw. Mitzad atzmei als Michael behema oder lahassoka betanur. If you look at the straw itself as feed for the animal, or to heat the oven, to put it as heat for the oven, as fire, as fuel. Straw has very little money value and importance. But when you use this to make bricks, you use Teven Levenim, as we see in Pare by Mitzrayim, Lebinyan, to a building Hulu inside Shabbos and Sachmer, then it gets a lot more value. It's being used for something very important. Und das ist given the Shiloh von Esav. By the Meiser benitten the Dan. That was his question by the Meiser in this case. He gave him Meiser from everything that is his, versus Lechumra, which this is a stringency. Von alles was man vermocht, everything you own is Lechayra Mokum Leimar. So there's room to say, as man rechen the Meiser Hatem and Melech, that you calculate, you count the tithing of the straw and the salt, nit lefi hamida mishkal leminya, not according to the measure, the weight or the number, b'fnei atzmai u'b'hoiva by itself, present what the current value is. V'maiser behema, as the tithe of behema, whatever it is, you take a tithe. Nor le the shavius from the zachar, maybe the value of these items. When he's going to use them, is going to be a lot more important. And since that's the case, that it's more important, by Melech V'Teven, by the salt and the straw, how do you calculate their value? As whether do we go by their value now, or the Leutzer Shavius B'Shas Menutze Al Tam, or we go by their value when you're going to use them, when you're going to mix them in into the food and they're going to give a taste, or into the straw, you're going to build with them, then they're going to get more value. How do we value them? And the Rebbe explains over here, which is, I think, a very important part, because uh, uh, the Rebbe explains you don't give a tithe from everything, single thing by itself. I mean, in that way, it wouldn't be a question. So why doesn't he just give a tithe? Give a tithe of the salt and a tithe of the straw, and that would be the value of, and that would be the value, whatever it's worth, whether now or in the future. But that's why the Rebbe Bavornt, the Rebbe cautions this in Ha'ara 32, a star, that the Meiser Mikol Asher Lo is not by giving Meiser from every min kind by itself, but you separate the Meiser from the value of all your assets. So it's not giving. So you have a certain value. And what is that value from the salt and the straw? How do we calculate that? And that you give whatever the monetary value of that. And this will sweeten for us the precise language of Rashi. Kasovur aviv shuhu medagdeg b'mitzvahs. His father would think, or was thinking, that he's very particular mitzvahs. As it is mekayim the mitzvahs kitikunem mit den gresten digdug b'cheshma kiyitzvah, that he's fulfilling the mitzvah with the greatest particular preciseness in calculation of kiyitzvah, because he's not asking that he's machmir b'mitzvah, but he's medakdek because he just wants to know how to evaluate. Mashenkin loitim pirush hameforshim, as opposed to, this is more better the language, as opposed to pirush hameforshim, as Esav had gewollt oisnem by Yitzchok, and that the way he was trying to impress Yitzchok durch weisen, as git meiser euch von Salchel welche sein nit mechuve meiser, that he's giving meiser from such items that are not really obligated in meiser. But mer maskim when the lotion, then the lotion should have been machmir b'mitzvahs, not medagdik, mahader b'mitzvahs, or particular kiyetzbei. But here, because here he was not, he was showing that he's medagdik, that it's, how do we evaluate it? And that fits exactly with the Rebbe's explanation. The Rebbe explained that he wanted to know how the tithe is given, by the value now or by the value, what it's really worth in later on. And the Rebbe will continue now in to explain in Yonim and Halacha from this from the Rashi. So the Rebbe now wants to bring out that whether Avraham gave Meiser, and that would be the basis for Yitzchak, and then Esav trying to build on that Meiser that was given, is really a machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid. Because when the Rambam brings out the mitzvahs that the forefathers did before Matan Torah, so the Rambam counts the mitzvah of Meiser by Yitzchak. And the Rabbit argues why Yitzchak, it should be Vaitin le Meiser Mekoil. Avram gave Meiser. And the Rebbe explains that the whether Avram gave Meiser or not, it's a big chiddush because it says Mekoil Asher Lo, he gave everything. And we know that Meiser is only from growing things. So according to the Raavad, even though it didn't fit all the exact criteria, like after Matan Torah, you don't give it, it still was Meiser. According to the Rambam, it wasn't Meiser. That's why it starts with Yitzchak. And that's the difference if we say Heich Ma'aser like Rashi, because that's like the Raavad says that Yitzchak gave Meiser, that Avram gave Meiser. And then the way uh, the Medrash says is he didn't give Meiser. Let's look inside. Hey, from the Inyonim of Floim al Derech HaHaloch in their Pirush Rashi, from the wondrous matter according to Halacha in this Rashi, V'damont frier siv beis, as in Medrash is the Loshen, that in Medrash the language is Heich Mesakrin. How do you fix? Und Rashi sagt Heich Ma'asrin. How do you tais? Yesh loymar as der Shina Lashonis, that the change of languages to fix or to tais is totally in der Plukta zwischen Rambam and Raavad is depended on the disagreement between the Rambam and Raavad. In Hilchas Melochim, read the Rambam, in Hilchas Melochim, the Rambam discusses wegen the mitzvahs was eine gewem koidem Matan Torah. The mitzvahs that were before Matan Torah. V'zel Lashonis. And this is what he writes there. Al Shisha Dvorim Nitztava Odom Horishin. It was the six things that Odom Horishin was commanded of the six of the seven mitzvahs b'nei which was commanded. Ba Avram v'nitztava, then Avram was added, v'hu hispalel shachris, and he davened shachris. V'Yitzchok, says the Rambam, hifrish meiser, specifically not Avram, but Yitzchok, hifrish meiser. So that mitzvah came by Yitzchok. Zogt der Ravid says, Hoyu royu loymar v'hu hifrish meiser, v'hu Avram hifrish meiser. You should have said that Avram because he started Meiser. Why is the Rambam saying only by Yitzchok? That's the challenge that the Ravid has to the Rambam. Lernen the Forshim, so the Forshim learn as the Rambam and Ravid seinen Lechuluk in the Pirush, that the Rambam and Ravid are disagreeing in what the meaning von Vayiten loy Meiser Mekoil was stated by Avram. In the Pasuk by Avram it says he gave him Meiser from everything. Leuten Rambam, according to the Rambam, is Vayiten le Meiser nit given in Geder from Afroshas Meiser. That was not defined as giving Meiser vi mitzvahs Meiser la'achrei Matan Torah, as the mitzvah Meiser after Matan Torah. So you can't say that that's a separate Meiser what he gave. Vorum, ein ha-Meiseres ne'egis ela begidule karka shaloi. Meiseres can only apply if something grows in your field, gedule karka, and therefore there is no Meiser other than that. So why give him Meiser Mekoil? So he explains that das is given belois von dem Sholol Shabol Yodim. That was only from the spoil that came to his hand. The Rebbe earlier said it's not only the Sholol, it was everything he owned. But here the Rebbe is learning in the Rambam that the Avram giving everything that was from the Sholol that came to his hands. Wie der Ragachover is mevayer, the Ragachover explains, as Leshitos Rambam is der Meiser given bedugmas mitzvahs trumas hameches, that Meiser was similar to the mitzvah trumas hameches from them Shviu Malkoyach was not genume melchemes Midian. That is the trumas of the tax that they gave from the capta they captured and from all was what they took, that they took Milchemes Midyan. Was the mitzvah is nit naeges l'doros. That's not a mitzvah which goes for generations. So the Rambam can't mention that as a mitzvah that they were commanded before Matan Torah, because that's not the same mitzvah at Matan Torah. We don't have that mitzvah. It's only by Milchemes Midyan. It was a specific hayra at the time. So it turns out that according to the Rambam, this is a different halacha in giving him a tenth, and it didn't start therefore with Avram. So that's what the Rambam writes. It started with Yitzchak. Masha'ekin leitner Ravid, it was given in Gather from Mitzvah's Meiser. According to the Ravid, what he gave was part defined in the Mitzvah Meiser. Now, even though that's not the usual Meiser, but that doesn't matter. On Afal Pi as Meiser is dafke from Gedule Karka. Meiser you give only from growing from the ground. And here he gave him a kol shelo is yesh loymar. So we can say that's not such a problem on the Ravid, because Aleph, der Tanai is achilish was hat sich aufgetan erst noch Matan Torah. That condition that it needs to be only grown from the ground, that only was came about after Matan Torah. So Mashenke in der Meiser from far Matan Torah, as opposed to the Meiser that was before Matan Torah, is given by alle Sachen. That was by all matters. Ona Yitzvin Aklal. Without the difference, Kimefurish Mikoil. The Beifla Meiser Mikoil, he gives him from everything. And it's still Meiser. But the fact that it didn't have the condition, that doesn't mean that it's not Meiser. It just means that it didn't have that condition, but it was still Meiser. So you can say about it that Avram gave Meiser. Weil derech we find by andere mitzvahs, so similar to like we find by other mitzvahs, was the Ovis of Mekayim given, that the forefathers observed, as they seien nit getom geworden mit alle Tnoim wie noch Matan Torah, that they weren't done with all the conditions as after Matan Torah. So even though that's the mitzvah, but it's not the same mitzvah. Weil derech yibum lifnei Matan Torah, was yibum lifnei Matan Torah. So after Matan Torah, it needs to be by the brother. But was in Damut given, at that point, before Matan Torah, the Ramban says, Aydeach, Oyaav, Oyakor min hamishpacha, was either by the brother, the father, or a relative of the family. And that's why also uh, Yehuda was going to marry Tamar, because it didn't have the precise condition that it's only the brother, but it was a relative. So it's not a conflict to say, holds the Ravid, that Avram gave Meiser without this condition. That's a new condition, but generally speaking, he did give Meiser. And number two, Meiser Davrom is given al derech Meiser Ksofim. This could be a tithing of monies. Money you have to give Meiser too. Now, Avrom gave Meiser from what he owned. Even if you're going to say that the obligation to give a tithe of money is only with Rabbanon, here we're talking about Avram gave him Meiser Mekoil. How could we say that this is started, according to the Rambam, it started from Avraham, because Avraham says he gave Meiser, and he gave it because Meiser Ksofim, because the whole chiv was not Minatayr, is only the Rabbanon. So that's not a problem also. We can still say that he fulfilled this mitzvah. Is noisef as canal by Yishmer Teirosi Lahavi Teirah Peh in a different as above. He says that he kept my Torah. That is includes Teirah Peh. So which means that, as the Rebbe explains further in Hora 47, that you can say by Yiten Loi Meiser, even though it was Meiser the Rabbanon, and that can be counted according to the Rav, or to the Rav, the mitzvah uh, that they fulfilled, that Avram fulfilled. Um, and the Rebbe brings it all, not all mitzvahs, just the mitzvahs that are specifically in the Torah. So the Torah could say Vayitin leMaiser Mekoil, even though it's a Maiser Midrabanon, because he did also the Dinim Drabanon, the Torah Soy, and Torah Shabal Peh, and he gave him that Meiser. So we can say about it that Abraham gave Meiser, the Meiser Ksofim. But the Rebbe says in the top of that is as verbunden mit der Tetzov of Mitzvahs Meiser. It's still tied, and as a result of the Mitzvahs Meiser, uh, even the Meiser Kesofim is a connected, is a part of Mitzvahs Meiser. Was the Father learned that Sifri Arois Meiser Kesofim, the Sifri learns tithing, your earnings, the money is from Posik Aser to Aser. You should give tithing, even though it's a mitzvah Torah. It's in the Posik in the Torah. Und der Riber is mitzvahs meiser in allgemein. So that's why the general mitzvah meiser, misyaches zu vayitn meiser davrom, it goes to vayitn meiser davrom. So according to the Rambam, vayitn meiser is not the din of meiser because it didn't meet the criteria of meiser. According to the Ravid, generally it is meiser, either as it's meiser kesofim, which is also associated to meiser, or we're going to say that at that point, the condition that it needs to be grown from the ground was not yet applicable then. So based on this, we can say, as der chilik zwischen Pirush HaMedrash and Pirush Rashi is told in the Pluktanal. So the difference between the way the Medrash says that Esav asked, how do you fix? And Rashi says, how do you tithe? It depends on this machloikis, whether Avram gave Meiser. The Das HaMedrash is Vayitin Lo Meiser Mekoil. According to the Medrash, he gave him Meiser, so he doesn't talk about Meiser. The Medrash says, how was it Misakin? Nit given I get there for Mitzvah's Meiser. It wasn't defined as the Mitzvah of Meiser, like the Rambam holds. Vibaldas Mitzvah's Meiser is nor from Gidule Karka. Hot nit kenor de Shailo. So therefore, since the Meiser is only from growing things, hot nit ken ort de Shaila, heich maasenes hamelechulu. How do you tithe the ken? Because there's no obligation b'chlal. So the Medrash, therefore, because he learns that there wasn't Meiser, so he says the Farzog the Medrash at the Shaila from Esav is given heich misakne milchot tabno. How do you fix it? Fix it meaning canal seed base, as I've explained. It wasn't asking to tithe it, but one saying what could be done to separate something just like we do Meiser. How could we do it? But he couldn't ask how do we tithing because this is not tithing. Tithing is only, as the Rambam says, it's not Avrom. This is not tithing, and therefore the question was how do you fix it? Rashi let him talk about canal siv gimel. Rashi learns, as we said before, in Siv Gimel, Avayitn Meiser Mekoil is given a gather for Mitzvah's Meiser that he gave that was actually Meiser. The Baal der Meiser is Mekoil. So everything about the Riber is Masim, the Shaila, Heich Masim, Mesamelech, Mesatemen. How do you tithe the Melech and Temen? Because it is Meiser. Because according to the Rambam, the Ravid, it's Meiser. And that's what Yitzchok, that's what Avram did. And because it's Meiser, even though it's not, this is Melech and Temen, there's still the question, how do you tithe it? Because you have to give Meiser, you give from everything. And from Vav, from Yenishal Teirish Repirush Rashi Zeh. The Rebbe wants to explain now why specifically did he say Tevin and Melech, even though the Rebbe explained that they have the special characteristic Heich because the value changes as it's used as a spice and food, and therefore, what's the question? What's the value? But the Rebbe said there's other things. The Rebbe wants to explain that specifically Tevin and specifically salt come from Gevura, and to for Esav, that's the response to Esav. Dafke mitzad Gevura, which is Mamtekes, as we'll see. For Yenshel Teshbirish Rashi, the Chedis Mechalsnik Glati. Was hat Esav gefragt, darf ich bin die zwei Sachen von Melech betonen. Why did he ask only about these two items of salt and the straw? Sicher seien da andere Sachen mit derselben Tchunan auch. There must be other things that have the same character. As wenn sie werden benutzt in Taruvis mit anderen Minim, when they're used in mixture with other kinds, bekommen sie Achshivas Gedoyla, leferach sie Achshivas Fnei Asmam. They get very important relative to their independent before you mix them in or before you get others there. So why do we say only these two things? Is the bir pnimi in them? So the inner explanation. And Alter Rebbe fragt in Tereu, Alter Rebbe asked in Tereu, about das Yitzchok hat gewusst, as ein Shem Shemayim Shogur Befiv, he knew that the name of Hashem is not common in the name of Esau, and therefore he was wondering when Yaakov was disguised as Esau and he was saying the Abish's name. So he said he got very confused because he says he's not used to having him mention the name of Hashem. So if Yitzchok knew that Esau doesn't have Hashem's name, Ein Shem Shemayim Shog B'Fishol Esau, V'yi Shaykh zu sagen, so how is it fit to say as Esau Hoim Rameu B'Shailos that he would trick him with questions? Eich Ma'asir Mesateven, how do you ties the straw when he says the guy doesn't, the Esau doesn't even mention the name of Hashem, and now all of a sudden he pretends to be such a religious person. And answered, Alter Rebbe answered, as Esau veris do lemato mitzad ha'pnimius, that the way Esau here below uh, and uh, and from his inside is Ein Shem Shemayim Shagur Befiv, meaning if he's not disguising or anything else, he doesn't really have the Shem Shemayim Shagur Befiv. That's over here. Aber Esau is in sein Shodesh, but the way Esau is in his Shodesh, Vachis Makivolo Melmailo, which hovers around him, surrounds him from above, is a Madrege in Kedusha. Esav is a high level in Kedusha. The word Mitzad Apnimius is from the Alter Rebbe, but we're trying to figure out exactly how it fits over here. But in any event, he is a very high Madrege in Kedusha. Reisha de Esav be'atfudi Yitzchak, as we know that the head of Esav fell into the lap of Yitzchak in the Morasa Machpelah after when he was trying to fight against Yaakov, and then Yaakov's son his head fell off and fell in the lap of Yitzchak. So Esav's head is in the lap of Yitzchak. The Shoresh von Esav, Gevura de Klippa, is from Yitzchak, meaning the root of Esav, which is the Gevura Klippa, comes from Yitzchak, Gevura de Kedusha. Umetzad bechinas hamakif, and that level of makif, which is higher, Esav shoyel ech maasines hateven. He asks, how do we ties the teven? So that I've said before, mitzad apnimius versus the makif. The makif is the way he's on a higher level. Over there, he's a higher madrega. So mitzad the madrega of makif, Esav is in a high madrega, can say hey maasines hateven. But here lamato, and mitzad apnimius, meaning not in the surrounding way, but what he is really. He's talking bad. Is ancient Shemaim Shogam Befif. Very partial, isn't it? Und der Vater Yitzchak gewollt geben die Brachos zu Esav. He wanted to give the Brachos to Esav, weil durch dem hat gewollt Mamshach sein dem Schödisch von Esav und Olamati. He wanted to bring it down, raise the root below. Was durch dem, was Ledas Yitzchak, wollt Ledas Yitzchak Esav nicht beigewollt. By giving him the Bracha, so in his opinion, Esav would have been sorted out. Aber sehr yes Leimar, als der Tambos Esav hat ausgeklebt, Davke dem Inyan von Heich Maasen bis Amelach bis Hateven. So that's why did he choose Davke ticing the salt and the Teven? Because this is all in the Mitzad the Makif, Mitzad the Bitter, as the Alter Rebbe explained the Torah. Is Valdos is Maramis of Zayn Bitter, because this hints to the bitter that we're trying to sort out Esau. Es steht in Chassidus as Melach is the Sherish Kol HaGvuris. That Melach is the root of all stringency. And the Far is Melach Mamtik Dinim. And that's why salt can sweeten judgment, while Ein HaGvuris Nim Taken El B'Sharsham, because the Gvuris are sweetened in the root. Kum Tuis. as in the minion from Asinas HaMelech, that you give tithing of the Melech is merumas, the biru from Huras the Esav, how to sort him out through the Melech which is Mamtik the Dinim in the Shorsham, and that's by bringing it down the Shorish of Esav. That's the way to be Mamtik him. That's why he asks about Melech. Masinas HaTeven, also Teven. There steht in Chassidus, as moitz v'teven she'enum rak pseulos hachita, that the shell and the straw is only the leftovers of the wheat. Zainen b'mchinas haklippus, that comes from klippus. On their far is Esav, sorry, mesitra the klippa, Esav that was from the side of klippa, shibachatz meshanoson memaiser memoitz v'teven. That's why he praised himself that he gave meiser from moitz and teven, which is klippa. And these are the reasons why Melech and Teven specifically to bring down the bitter of Esav, and that's why he has the far state by bitter from Esav La'asid Lavai. When Esav will be sorted out, he says, "V'hoi beis Yaakov Eish, ubeis Yosef Lahava." Yaakov will be Eish, and Yosef will be Lahava, flame. Ubeis Esav Lakash, straw. He will be straw. That's the Teven. So should be quickly in our days with the coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu, that this temen will be burned, that straw that he asked, and that's the birur, this destruction of Esav, Beiseisel Lakash. So should be made of men b'bis Mashiach Tzidkenu. This is Sichos Shabbos Pashas Toldos Tofshin Lamed Daled.